I don't know if I'll ever go back to the gym at Mammoth Spring. I just got kicked out of a basketball game. The refereeing was questionable, and I let them know it. And I thought I was going to get escorted out. I just got yelled at and tossed out. Brad. But we had the pep rally for the girls going to state championship Friday, and I was to play a role. So I thought I'd just wear a green shirt to church tonight because I could. All right, the book of Habakkuk. If you are looking at your outline, I tell you, somebody go ahead and just read Habakkuk 1:6, please. It's page 1032. Okay, so that right there identifies the approximate date. The Chaldeans, this is another term that is used in the Old Testament for the inhabitants of Babylon. And so the Chaldeans, let's just say the Babylonians, are marching through the breadth of the land. They're on the way, they're in the midst of their conquest, and part of that conquest is the nation of Israel. And let's do this first. Who is the king of Babylon at this time? Very familiar name to us. Nebuchadnezzar. So there are several contemporaries of the prophets. I would say probably the primary one we think of is Daniel and his dealings with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. We're looking somewhere shortly before 606 BC. The Babylonians attacked the nation of Judah, southern Israel, on 3 separate occasions under that leadership, 606, 597, and 586 BC, in the process of capturing the land, occupying the land, and killing a lot of people, but then also taking a lot of captives back home. Habakkuk is a question asker. It's a very interesting book. And so I want to look at those questions and deal with them contextually, but then maybe think about them in a bit larger picture, let's say. So, chapter 1 and verse 2. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Why dost thou show me iniquity, and cause me to behold grievance? For spoiling and violence are before me, and there are that raise up strife and contention. There are those that are raising up strife and contention. So, Habakkuk, he just starts. He just goes right into it. And essentially questions God, why don't you do something? What are you waiting for to act? Of course, again, within the context of verse 6, the Chaldeans marching through the breadth of the land. And you think of that line of questioning there. We'll get to the other verses here in just a minute. How long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Now, obviously, this is him. It's obvious that God heard. God knew very well what was going on, and we'll talk about that too. But it's from Habakkuk's perspective, it's like God is disconnected and perhaps unconcerned. You're showing me iniquity. I'm seeing all the grievance, as the King James says there. The New King James says trouble. And you're not doing anything about it. So then the second round of questioning, somebody read chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. Okay, so again, really in verse 12 there, from everlasting, aren't you all powerful? Are you incapable of acting? And of course, I don't think Habakkuk believed that, but from his perspective, what he's witnessing in the land and the approach of the enemy, it seems to Habakkuk that Well, it's like he says there in verse 12, we shall not die. But in the moment, maybe it felt that way, because they're being overrun. They know what's coming. And again, we've kind of talked about this throughout the prophets. When you go back to the law of Moses, the book of Deuteronomy specifically, like chapters 26, 27, and 28, as Moses is giving some of his farewell messages to the Israelites, one of them is, if you break the covenant, you're going to be taken away. They're going to be a nation whose language you don't speak. They don't look like you. They're going to kill a lot of you, and they're going to take the rest of you captive. And so it's not, again, that the prophets didn't know that. And perhaps to some extent some of the people, it's not that they didn't know that, but now they're in the midst of it. And are you not from everlasting? Aren't you the eternal God? So that's in the moment. Well, then notice verse 13. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. In other words, the idea is you're not going to tolerate it. It's not that he can't see it, okay? I meant to look this up earlier, and I forgot to. But the book of Proverbs, I think I know what verse it is. Yeah, Proverbs 15:3. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. So what we would call the omniscience of God, He's not limited in His knowledge as to what's going on. But the nation of Judah in this time historically has been set for judgment. For years they've neglected the law, and they've had back and forth with the kings. They've had some good ones and they've had some terrible ones. Right towards the end, they've had some terrible ones. There's no question about that. And so they're reaping what they have sown. So he asks these questions. Again, chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, and then chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. And then here's what he decides to do. Somebody read chapter 2 and verse 1, what Habakkuk decides to do. Okay. I will stand upon my watch. I was told that he was the smallest man in the Bible. I don't know if you've ever heard that one or not, but he stood on his watch. He's going to pay attention. He's going to watch what God's going to do. Well, here's the answer. Write it down. You start reading in verse 2. Write it down, make it plain. So verse 2 there says, that he may run that reads it. The idea of get the message out. Here's what's going to happen. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end of it shall speak and not lie, though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. So Habakkuk's, he's going to step back and see. He's asked his questions. He waits for God's answer, and he wants to see what's going to happen. Now, you look at chapter 1, verse 4. I want to pay some attention to this in just a minute. But think about the questions that he asks here, okay? How long shall I cry? Why are you permitting me and obviously everybody else, the nation, to see all this grievance? Verse 12, aren't you the Holy One? The everlasting God, the all-powerful, the all-knowing God. And then the question at the end of chapter 1, verse 13, you're holding your tongue. You're not doing anything. When the wicked devoureth the man that is more righteous than he. It's kind of like, some of the Psalms we were going through. One of the things the psalmist asked on several occasions was, why do you allow the wicked to prosper? It doesn't make sense. And I would say at times we probably feel that way. Somebody on the live stream asked a question. As far as God looking at evil, didn't God send angels to see if the things in Sodom were as bad as their cry? Yeah, messengers were sent to Abraham about all of that, and to Lot, by the way. Genesis 13:13 tells us that the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked. They had a reputation. But those men that were sent by God were sent to Abraham and sent to Lot about what was going to happen and then what they needed to do as a result of what would happen. So it's not that God can't see wickedness and can't look on it. That's not what Habakkuk 1 and verse 13 says. Thou art of purer eyes to behold evil than to behold evil, and you cannot look on iniquity. Well, He sees all things. But the idea is you're not going to sit back and tolerate it, so what are you waiting for right now? And so then God's response is, well, it's going to happen, and as He says there in chapter 2 and verse 3, it's an appointed time. God's in control, essentially, is what we're saying there. Any questions or comments on anything so far? Okay. Somebody read chapter 1 and verse 4. This is an interesting thought here.
Therefore the law is slack, and judgment doth never go forth. For the wicked doth compass about the righteous, therefore wrong judgment proceedeth.
Okay. The law is slacked, and judgment doth never go forth. Justice is the idea there. Injustice all around us. Well, how was the law slacked? What does that mean? Why? It's weak. Okay, it's not that the law was weak. The law in Habakkuk's eyes is not being enforced, and so it's slacked. Like, somebody turn over to Romans 1 and read verse 18. I think it's Romans 1:18. I think this is like a bit of a commentary on that idea of the law is slacked and justice is not going forth.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness.
Okay. Ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth. That word hold means suppress. We can suppress the truth, can't we? I mean, the truth is the truth regardless. And the Word of God is powerful regardless. But we can suppress it. I can suppress God's Word in my life by being ungodly and unrighteous. And I think that's the idea here. The law is slacked. They had a law, but they see the Babylonians coming in, or approaching, you might say. They know what's coming. There's injustice everywhere. And that's the idea. The wicked they've encircled the righteous. There's no justice proceeding. Why don't you do something? That's essentially the message of the book of Habakkuk. So then, in response to that, starting in chapter 1 and verse 5, God Himself, and this is seen in several places in the prophets, it's God Himself who is raising up the Chaldeans. He says, verse 6, For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful, and their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. In other words, they're their own standard. They're not doing what they were doing, the Babylonians, thinking, well, the God of heaven has commissioned me to do this. I'm God's tool. That's not their mindset. Their mindset is, they've got that land, and we want it, and we're going to take it. So that's the meaning of verse 7. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed from themselves. And then he begins talking in verse 8, describing their speed and their strength. You are not going to stop them. At this point in time, it's too late for Judah to right the ship, you might say. God. Yes. Because Habakkuk's asking the questions in verses 2 and 3, and then making the observation that the law is not being enforced, and then God answers. It goes down through verse 11. And then verse 12, it's kind of like a dialogue. Then verse 12, Habakkuk speaks back up with more questions, says, chapter 2 and verse 1, I'm going to stand by and wait and see what happens. And then God responds again in chapter 2 and verse 2, and with several things here. So we'll pay attention to that. Any other questions or comments before we proceed? Okay? All right, chapter 2 and verse 4 states a principle That was true under the Old Covenant, and it's still true under the New. Somebody read Habakkuk 2:4. Somebody else get, Derek, will you get Galatians 3:11, please? Somebody read Habakkuk 2:4. Okay, one of the 7 things that God hates is a proud look. Well, his soul which is lifted up in him, which is lifted up, is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Now we see that statement several times in the Old Testament and several times in the New. So read Galatians 3:11, please, Derek. Yes. Okay, the just shall live by faith. If you're going to be just, if you're going to be right in God's eyes, you live by faith. You're not justified by the law of Moses. Paul's speaking to the churches of Galatia there. Well, here, the same thing was true under the Old Covenant. You're going to live by your faith. Well, then the question is, well, how do you obtain faith? Well, faith comes by God's Word, by the revelation of God's will. And so, a just man lives by his faith, his belief in God, his compliance with God and His will. You know, the Babylonians, again, they're not concerned about that. They have all their own gods, and they're again, the political power, and they're marching through the breadth of the land, as the text has said. The only hope for Israel, well, Judah, is to live by faith. And, well, frankly, that's our only hope, too, is to live by faith. Romans 1:17, talking about the gospel, says, "For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith." That's what we do. The Christian lives by faith. So I wanted to touch on that because that's a prominent theme throughout Scripture, Old and New Testaments. Because, you know, the old law, and the book of Hebrews even talks about this, like Hebrews 9, I think it's verse 6. I think it's verse 6. Let me look at that real quick. Talks about the services of the tabernacle, the sacrifices, and the washings and everything. Well, Hebrews 9:6 says, "Now, when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God." He talks about that to some extent. Here it is. It's verse 10. Those things that he offered. It says, "which stood only in meats and drinks and diverse washings and carnal ordinances." You know, under the Old Covenant, there were a lot of things you had to do physically. Like he was just saying, all the offerings, the cleansings that you had to do of yourself, the preparations that you had to make. But you still had to do that stuff out of faith, didn't you? The just shall live by faith. You do what God says do. Well, while the new covenant is a different covenant, a new law, the just still live by faith. And again, faith is acting upon the commands of God. That's what it means. Any questions or comments on any of that? Conduct yourself. The just shall conduct himself by faith. That's, to me, one of the greatest examples of maybe like a demonstration of that is from Hebrews 10:32 all the way into Hebrews chapter 12. Like Hebrews, for instance, Hebrews 10:39 says, "We are not of those who draw back unto perdition," destruction, "but of those who believe to the saving of the soul." Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. That's the very next verse. You know, and you guys have heard me say this many times, that the chapter and verse breakups don't help us a lot of times. And I think that's a good example. We are those who believe to the saving of the soul. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So Hebrews 11 explains what Hebrews 10:39 says. And it does so by showing you the life of who? Abel, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, all those, what we call the heroes of faith, all those people died in faith. That's what the chapter, well, that's how the chapter ends, essentially. These all have died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. Then you get into Hebrews 12, and the author's, and he's writing to those Christians in the first century, but we learn from it too. You start in chapter 12 there, and he says, "Seeing then that we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and run with endurance the race that is set before us." So that's what it means to believe to the saving of the soul. That's what it means that the just shall conduct himself by faith. I think that Hebrews 10:32 to, really through the rest of the book, but that segment right there shows me what the end of Habakkuk 2:4 means. The just shall live by his faith. Anybody else?
Can you even be a Christian if you don't have faith?
You can't even please God if you don't have faith.
You
No.
pretend you were a Christian.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you didn't have faith in God and what He tells us, you have to be a pretty miserable life, I would think.
It's not possible to be a child of God without faith. And so I was talking to a friend of mine this morning about faith from Hebrews chapters 3 and 4. Hebrews 3 and 4 talks about the children of Israel not entering into the rest because of their unbelief. And it's interesting, when you do a little digging on that word unbelief, it means non-compliance. Okay? So he has a law enforcement officer in his congregation. We've got somebody like that here. So what does it mean if you have someone who's non-compliant? They're not doing what you're telling them to do. Israel was non-compliant. It's not. So think about it like this. They're marching towards the promised land. They've got the food they need. Their clothes never wear out. Their shoes never wear out. Their feet don't swell. The Red Sea is parted. They send 12 spies into the promised land, right? To spy it out for 40 days. What happened in those 40 days when they spied out the land? What did they see? Everything God told them was true. What did they bring back with them? They brought a cluster of grapes that had to be carried on a pole between two men. And what else? There was something else. Anyway, just what Kevin said. It was everything God said. And so they had faith. And they said that. It's recorded in Numbers 13. It's just like the Lord said it was. But what was the hang-up? Yeah. And that's what Hebrews 3 and 4 says. They could not enter in because of their unbelief. But it's not, that's the thing though, it's not that they didn't believe God, because they did. They had the evidence right in front of them. They didn't do what God said do. God said, go in and possess the land. I'll fight your battles for you. They didn't do that. They were afraid. Now, Joshua and Caleb said, we can go up at once and possess it. Caleb said that, I think. But they were non-compliant with the commands of God. That's unbelief. And you cannot be a Christian like that. It's not possible. Yeah. What command of God, so baptism is a good example because a lot of people argue against that. But what command of God could you leave undone and justify yourself and be right with God? Jesus, one of the things He condemned the Pharisees for was they paid close, and this is in Matthew 23, they paid close attention so much that they weighed out, they tithed mint, anise, and cumin. They even got the spice measurements down right when they were offering the tithes to God. But what did they leave out? The weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and the love of God. He says, those things you should have done, the minor details, you might say, the measurements, the offerings, that's not minor, that wasn't the right word, but those details, he said, those things you should have done and not left the others undone. So, it's not a pick and choose kind of thing with the commandments. And whether it's baptism or any other command you could think of, it's not, to live by faith means you're going to do what God says do. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. We understand that. But you can still live by faith, and you can still be considered just, because the just lives by faith.
Think about Moses,
Moses?
he himself, he was not allowed to enter the
Yeah.
promised land.
Yeah.
Just for simply smoting the rock. God
Yeah.
said,
Speak to it. He was non-compliant. Does that, so he was one of the ones that Hebrews 3 would include as not entering in because of unbelief. But he was in the presence of God himself. It's not that he didn't believe in God, it's that he didn't do what God said do. Yeah. Well, in Deuteronomy 34, no other man knew God like Moses did. There was nobody else that had a relationship like that with God. So we know what it means to live by faith. The just shall conduct himself by his faith. Anybody else? All right. Habakkuk condemned the sinful attitudes of the wicked with woes. We see a lot of woes throughout the Old Testament. Those are words of warning. 2:6, woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. Covetousness, theft. Chapter 2 and verse 9, woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high. Chapter 2 and verse 12, woe to him that buildeth a town with blood. Okay, you take control with violence. Chapter 2, verse 15, woe to him that giveth drink to his neighbor. Chapter 2 and verse 19, woe to him that saith to the wood, awake. That's idolatry. Listen to that. To the dumb stone. Well, what does that mean? Dumb. Can't speak. We know how we use dumb, but you make your idols out of things that can't even speak. You lay it over with gold and silver. It doesn't breathe, but the Lord is in His holy temple. You're using these inanimate objects, but God is in heaven, and you don't turn to Him. So you have all those woes. And then what you have in Habakkuk chapter 3 is a prayer of praise to God even when things cannot get worse. Talks about God's power, obviously, His ability. And I love the way the book ends. Somebody read Habakkuk 3, 17 and 19 for us, please.
although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vine, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the field shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and He will make my feet like hinds' feet, and He will make me to walk upon my high places to the chief singer on my strength.
Okay, so so the Babylonians are approaching, but when they come, they're not friends. They're not friendly and kind captives. It's what we call, scorched earth. They're coming for everything, and they're not going to leave anything left. So, fig tree, fruit on the vine, the olives, our flocks, it's all gone. It can't get any worse. If something can go wrong, it's going to go wrong. But I will still trust in God, is Habakkuk's message. And that's the nature of life, isn't it? It's like sometimes if things can go wrong, every possible thing that can does. Well, where does our faith go in times like that? Well, the just shall live by his faith. We're never promised ease and happiness all the time and no difficulty. That's not reality. But even in the most difficult times, where is our faith? And again, faith is more than just a mental acceptance that God exists. That's part of it, yes, but there's a lot more to living by faith than just believing that there's a God in heaven. Yeah. I mean, that's a current situation that could be comparable to what we're reading about here. The enemy's approaching, they're attacking. What can you do as what can any individual there do to stop what's happening? Nothing. So what would a Christian do? And I would say it's very hard for us to even begin to put ourselves in their shoes. What would you do? Okay. Well, it's, as we say in the reverse sometimes, that'd be better than the alternative, wouldn't it? So Habakkuk, I think, sets a good model for us there. Yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. Like you say from verse 17, if it's going to go wrong, it will, but we can still rejoice in the Lord. He's my strength, verse 19. All right, anything else on Habakkuk?
We know that the Old Testament is written for our learning and good examples to learn from that. So I think it's important for us to understand that there in chapter 3, verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will joy in the God of my salvation. The God that Habakkuk is doing that with is the same God we serve.
Yep. That's right. Okay, so next Wednesday night, Zephaniah. We got 3 chapters, and let me see here real quick. 18, 15, 53 verses. So you can be reading that every day till next Wednesday.